I think I've done it. After years of trying various different systems, as you can see on screen now, I think I've found the perfect, breathable but effective internal wall insulation system for this old Victorian property that doesn't have any cavity walls. In today's video, I'm going to tell you a little bit of the thought process behind it and what system I've installed. Okay, quick bit of background. I did a video a few months back explaining all the problems I had when back in 2010, when we bought this cottage, the builders dot and dabbed standard plasterboard to all the external walls in this kitchen. Now, I explained at the time that insulating internally an old Victorian property like this is a thorny subject that triggers a lot of strong views. And the video prompted some really great discussions in the comment section below. But one of these comments stopped me dead in my tracks. I previously insulated my daughter's room with Kingspan K118 insulated plasterboard, which took a room which we couldn't heat into a room which was a really pleasant space to live in. And so I said in the video that I didn't want to go down the restoration route of just whacking some lime plaster on the wall because it wouldn't keep my house warm enough. And Iron Imp waded in to say, actually, Charlie, you're doing the restoration lobby a bit of a disservice here because they wouldn't just recommend that, they would recommend a breathable insulation product. And this really did get me thinking, and I decided that I owed it to myself in this renovation, and more importantly to you guys, to do a bit of research so that this time round I properly nailed it with the solution that I went for. Now, I go into a lot of detail on the pros and cons of the different systems in that video that I told you about a minute ago. But if you don't have a chance to watch that video, here's a quick summary because I think it's really important that you understand the benefits and also the flaws of the existing systems on the market relating to installation in old properties like this to inform your decision on what you decide to use, but also so that you can understand why the system I've ended up using today is so good. Okay, let's start with the absolute gold standard, the thing that you'd always do if you had the opportunity, and that is external wall insulation, or EWI for short. External wall insulation is so good on so many levels. By insulating the outside of your property, you can treat the internal brickwork, render, plaster, all of that stuff as a property that can be heated up, just like I've done with my underfloor heating system. You achieve great thermal massing because when you've got the heating on, the walls become basically radiators radiating the heat back. And with all the insulation on the outside, the internal walls can breathe, which they obviously can't with, for example, PIR-based systems. And with the walls being able to breathe, condensation isn't such an issue, although you should always have a vapor strategy in mind, whatever the age of your property, old or new. And to that end, check out my video on this coming up on screen now. The problem with external wall insulation is it's not always practical. You might have to get planning permission, and there are lots of issues with sills, eaves, decorative cornicing, that sort of thing, where putting a big thermal slab on the outside of your property might not be practical. So that is why most of us have to think about insulating internally rather than on the outside. Now, my builders back in 2010 didn't even bother to insulate the walls. They just dot and dabbed, glued a load of plasterboard to the walls, and there are multiple problems with this. Firstly, there's no vapor control, so moisture can just travel through that plasterboard until it hits a cold surface, known as its dew point, and at that point it just condensates, turns into mold, etc. Now, you can get forward back plasterboard, but this is not, you can't dot and dab that to the walls, you can't glue it to the walls. And as we'll come on to with PIR in a minute, you've got breaks between each sheet and where you cut through for socket boxes. So that brings us on to internal wall insulation. And one of the most common ways to do this, as I said earlier on, I've done this in 3 rooms of the house now, is to use an insulated plasterboard. Kingspan K118 is what I've tended to use in the past. This is very common in the industry because it's so easy to do. Just gluing those plasterboard sheets to the wall. Although if you read the small print, you're always told you're meant to mechanically fix as well. But there are big problems with using this system. Although a lot of the products have a vapor barrier built into them in between the plasterboard and the insulation, that vapor barrier is broken at every point where you butt sheets up to each other, where you cut through the sheets for your socket boxes, and obviously on internal corners. I've asked Kingspan and Ecotherm what their views are on this, and they've never given me a satisfactory response. But if you look at brilliant YouTube channels like Steve the Roofer's, you'll understand just how important it is to stop there being any breaks in vapor barriers when you're trying to stop vapor getting into the wall. Because if there is a break, any weak point, that vapor will flood through to the cold surface behind. Tendency is to think, well, this doesn't affect me because you generally can't see it, but just look what I found recently in my kitchen. Come in this morning, I got a drop of water on my head walking through here. You can see it sort of forming on the window frame, and what's happening, we haven't got a proper cavity up here. It's just a sort of mini cavity created by the builders when they sorted out the lintel to put this new door in. And if I put my fingers up here, that space is absolutely sopping. This is the point and why it's so important to get your insulation, internal insulation, properly sorted, because the internal walls absolutely fine, dry as a bone, but that point there, which is effectively the dew point because it's the coldest point, where the cold bricks outside hit, I suppose, warmer air in this room, that's where you get your dew point, and that's why you get all of this condensation. And look how the moisture's flooded through these socket boxes, my earlier point, but with a good vapour management strategy you can do a lot to limit this. The other problem with these PIR based systems is, of course, they're not breathable. So although I used one of these systems to very good effect in our bedroom and was planning to do so in here, after Iron Imp got me thinking about this in his comment, I spoke to my brother-in-law who's in the industry, and to cut a long story short, I eventually came across a company called SWIP, who do breathable internal wall insulation systems. And I should emphasize here, they're not paying me or otherwise sponsoring today's video. So let's have a quick delve into their product to see what it's all about. SWIP have taken a system-based approach to IWI, where each element has been designed to work together to deliver the required performance. It's specifically designed for retrofitting to existing external solid or cavity walls like mine. Installing the 95mm insulation on a typical uninsulated wall like mine will bring about a U-value improvement of over 80%, from 2 to 0.3. You've got thermally engineered composite insulated studs which eliminate the cold bridging issue you would encounter with standard wood studs. They're faced with OSB and are anchored in position with screws. 5 fixings per full length stud, and when fixed the battens have a huge pull-out strength. You infill between each SWIP stud with a Knauf mineral wool that has ECOS technology. So there's no added formaldehyde or phenol, so very low levels of dust generated, and it's very soft to handle. And this is quite a big deal. If you compare rock wool with the Knauf wool, on the face of it they look like pretty similar products, but the Knauf was a much more pleasant product to install in the walls than the rock wool was in the ceiling. A lot of dust came out of the rock wool, it just got in your face, your eyes. You wanted to be putting a suit on, full respiration eyewear, whereas with this Knauf wool, you don't really feel any protection is necessary. You then add a vapour closed or vapour open barrier depending on your requirements, and the nature of your walls and where you live, the weather you're subjected to, will have a bearing on this. I went for the Intello vapour open membrane to give my walls the best possible chance of breathing. And on top of the membrane goes standard plasterboard and plaster. Now this is going to cause a lot of debate, and a lot of you have already said that it was a great shame I didn't use a breathable plasterboard and plaster when I talked about this in my recent update video. Let me know what you think in the comment section below, but certainly as far as I'm concerned, plasterboard does let vapour through, and you saw when I cut that piece out of the original kitchen wall that there was mould behind. And indeed, to quote Sam, our resident guru on our Discord forum that obviously you can access through my Patreon membership, the idea is to create a pressure gradient that encourages vapour to move to the exterior rather than the other way around. So in my view, vapour does get through, it just gets through lime plaster products easier than it does gypsum. And here's a simple analogy that I also pinched off Sam. Think of plasterboard as a sponge, but in the case of lime plaster, a really rubbish sponge, as shown here by this reticulated foam. So in the case of a lime-based system, water just goes straight through it. The sponge just won't retain any water. Whereas in the case of your gypsum plaster, water does get through it, just not as easily. Now, while SWIP don't currently have a preference or recommendation on this, I can see where if the building that you're insulating is, say, listed or extremely exposed to the elements, your architect or Heritage England, Heritage Scotland, whoever that may be, might recommend a product that's more breathable, like lime plaster. We had a bit of a chat on the forum about this Vapour plasterboard, but came to the conclusion that the additional coating on it just makes it more impermeable than a standard plasterboard. Anyway, that's enough background. Let me show you how I got on with the install. First up, I had to trim down the insulating layer I installed for the underfloor heating screed, and also the expansion strip in front of that to make way for the horizontal section of the insulated stud. It's also suggested you apply a Parge coat to level off the wall, making install easier. I've had enough mess to last a decade though, so I decided not to bother doing this. More on how I levelled everything off in a minute. And believe you me, there was a lot of levelling to do. Fixing these SWIP studs is obviously the main part of the installation process. So I'll just guide you very quickly through the tools that I've used for this part of the job. Firstly, 18-volt mitre saw, not essential but a really easy way to cut the studs. You get all the screws and fixings you need to fix the studs to the wall. And I also bought these monster screws because with my crazy walls I had some massive gaps behind some of the SWIP studs. Workflow is always a big thing on jobs like this, so I used 2 drills, one with a longer narrow bit to drill through the studs and the second to actually drill the holes for the fixing. As you know, there's OSB on the front. I did countersink the battens as well because where I wasn't installing the battens flush on the wall and therefore couldn't drive the screw all the way in, I had to sort of more gently fix it in position, as you'll see in a minute. And then I've got an impact driver to screw the battens into place. And then foam. I've used a lot of this stuff because of all the levelling I've had to do. And I do recommend you get a non-stick one like this because I've used about 15 or 20 cans of this now and I still haven't had to clean out the gun. And if you've got uneven walls like me, a rasp file and a saw is well worth having as well. So I started off on the horizontal sections fixing the floor and ceiling studs before moving on to the vertical studs. Remember, you need 5 fixings per stud, minimum 75mm from the edge, 600mm spacings and a minimum of 40mm penetrating into the brick behind. I wanted everything to be as true as possible, which involved notching or scribing the studs around lumps and bumps in the wall. One of the things I loved about these studs is that they're straight as a dice, so you know when you've overscrewed the stud on an uneven wall. With each stud in position, I locked it in place with expanding foam. And a bit of a tip, give the nozzle of the gun a quick spray with some cleaner and it's ready for the next time you need it. You could of course wait until the end before foaming everything, but I like to do it bit by bit as it broke up the job and gave me a bit of variation. With the first 2 horizontal studs fixed, I can turn my attention to the vertical studs, which you position at 600mm centres, leaving a 550mm gap between the studs. And this is important as it means you can push each sheet of knauf insulation or SWIP batt in place without cutting it down. Again, I wanted the vertical studs to be plumb or at the very least to line up with the horizontal studs. This involved trimming them back in places. And then each and every gap between the stud and the wall needs to be filled with foam. One of my Discord members asked why I didn't build a frame like I did here. The answer is the OSB at the front of the stud isn't strong enough to support the entire frame and my walls were so uneven it made sense to do each one bit by bit. But I ended up with a pretty plumb and incredibly well aligned and extremely firm framework. Internal corners are done like this and you infill the corner void with insulation before fixing in place the adjacent batten so that the insulation is continuous around the corner. And for reveals, you stud up to the edge of the reveal. This was the point where I had some pretty wild gaps, and so what I tended to do here was loosely position the stud in place, sometimes screwing through the OSB to get it completely plumb and to stop the stud moving, foam behind it and then tighten the screw when the foam had gone hard. And for this one, a bit of masking tape stopped the foam falling out whilst it was setting. As you stud around the room, careful attention has to be paid to any joist gaps which could be a potential source for cold bridging, and these need to be insulated. Careful consideration has to be given to the integrity of the intermediate floor joists where they are embedded in external walls. These new ones were mostly tannelised, the ones that weren't were treated with additional bituminous paint where they were embedded in the wall. So we decided to take the vapour barrier up in between the joists, supported by offcuts of the SWIP studs. You'll see how this works with the internal membrane shortly. SWIP's advice was to leave this zone uninsulated, however, as it contains the original timbers embedded in the wall that are not tannelised. I've obviously spoken about the complexity of installing sockets in internal wall insulation, but the SWIP studs really come into their own here. I'd recommended these telescopic stud and joist brackets on the Discord forum, and they didn't disappoint. And if, like here, you push the pipework through the batts, you've just got to remember to seal all holes with expanding foam afterwards. So then it was in with the insulation, or SWIP batt as they call it. I've said a lot about this already, but suffice to say it was easy and pleasant to install. I generally cut it with an old carving knife, although it's also easy to cut with scissors. The batts need to completely fill the insulation zone between each stud, so you friction fit them, and where you have to cut the insulation you make it 5mm wider than the stud gap. And where possible you should probably leave your cables in front of the insulation to avoid any derating issues. And so it was onto the Vapour Open Intello Plus membrane, not to be confused with a Vapour barrier or Vapour closed membrane that lets nothing through. How does it work? Well, that's probably something for another video, but it basically changes its vapour permeability in response to the relative humidity of the surrounding air. The membrane becomes more vapour open when exposed to higher relative humidity and more vapour closed in drier conditions. Remember me talking about the flaws to insulated plasterboard systems in that there's a break between each sheet of insulation? Not anymore, as you're applying a complete system and sealing all penetrations and perimeters before you board. You get two different tapes, although they both do a similar job. The blue to join two pieces of the membrane together, or like here when I had to cut into the membrane to alter the location of the electrics, and the white to go around the perimeters. They both do similar jobs, although the white is slightly easier to use as it has a split tear-off strip on the back. And this is how you completely seal up a socket box with the white tape, with the split strip making it really easy to position the tape before finally sticking it down. You also get this primer for sealing the floor and the joists before you apply the perimeter tape. You need a staple gun to fix it in place. On the first room, for some reason, we fixed it in vertical sections, which is fine, but it meant we used a lot more of the blue tape than we needed to. And this is how you're meant to do it horizontally. And here's a small section I put into the right of our bifold doors. Around the window reveals, it's a good idea to tape the reveals before you start insulating them. And why the blue tape? Because at this point I'd run out of white. Which brings us nicely onto the reveals. The first point here, you've got two different types of insulation boards to choose from. This 12.5mm board for reveals where you haven't got a lot of space around the window frame, you can plaster directly onto it, and a 27mm insulated board where you do have room to work with. I chose the 27mm board for the window and door reveals because luckily I've got plenty of space. Cut the boards to the reveal size. I used my circular saw freehand hooked up to a vacuum, but if you've got one, a track saw might be a better option for a straighter cut. I got into a bit of a mess with the first lot because I didn't seal the membrane around the perimeter of the window before I added the insulated plasterboard. And check out the comedy foam slumping here. That was a bit messy. The next reveal board was neater, whilst the ceiling board was, well, still a bit emotional. But by the time I got to the TV room windows, I was getting the hang of the foaming after all that practice on the kitchen walls. I sealed the membrane to the reveal before adding the insulation board. You need to cut away the plasterboard from the ends so that when you add the sides, the insulation is continuous and not broken up by the plasterboard. My mini circular saw was brilliant for this. With the horizontal section in place, I then applied foam to the sides, and then bent the horizontal ceiling section to slide that into position without displacing too much foam. And I made a lot of use of my Magnuson extension support rod on this project. Foam doesn't stick instantly and needs a few minutes to cure, and I learned the best way to fix it in place was to lightly pin each section with drywall screws to the OSB at the front of the SWIP studs, but also by inserting a drywall screw a couple of millimetres into the window frame, as these are all covered when the reveals were plastered. Lots of adjustments with my combination square and the spirit level, and you have a perfectly plumb and beautifully insulated window reveal. And I use this insulated plasterboard for the bifold reveals and also around the front door. What's so different about using products like Instastick as opposed to the dot and dab adhesive is you put the dot and dab adhesive on, smack a bit of plasterboard up to the wall, give it a bit of a bash with your spirit level, and you're pretty much there. Whereas with this stuff, because it's so much lighter when you put it on, you end up having to manipulate the surfaces. Got a screwdriver here to make sure you've got your levels bang on as you wait for the sort of 5 to 10 minutes, whatever it is, for this stuff to go off. I'm not saying I don't like it, my plasterer doesn't like it, but it's very different. I much prefer to have this foam inside my wall than a load of moisture from the plasterboard adhesive. But even so, it's not as easy to use. That's it for today. Stay tuned on my channel because I'll be posting lots of in-depth videos over the next few months of everything else I've been getting on with on this project. And of course, if you're new to my channel, I would love to have you subscribe. You can do that by clicking on the link here, and don't forget to click the bell notification icon so you get notified of all my future uploads. See you soon.